For 10 years, Dr. Cecelia Vane had poured every ounce of herself into a town that tolerated her skill while questioning her place. She had learned to want nothing beyond the four walls of her clinic, nothing beyond the clean logic of medicine, nothing that could be taken from her again. Then, on the worst night of the August storm, a soaked and silent stranger pounded on her door, and something cracked open inside her chest that no amount of careful living had ever quite managed to seal shut. This is the story of the woman who thought she had already survived everything, and the man who made her realize she had merely been waiting. Like this video and comment the name of your city below. Watch all the way to the end, because this story is going to stay with you. The ledger was perfect. That was the thing about numbers that Cecelia Vane had come to love above almost everything else in her 34 years of living. Numbers did not change their minds. They did not smile at you across a Sunday supper table, and then look through you the following morning as though you had ceased to exist overnight. They did not hold a community dance and position themselves near the prettiest girl in the room, while you stood by the punch bowl in a blue silk dress you had saved for 3 months to purchase your heart hammering foolishly in your chest, waiting for a moment that was never in fact going to come. Numbers simply were what they were. The August heat had not broken even at midnight. Through the single window of her clinic, Cecelia could smell the storm before it arrived, that particular heaviness in the air that pressed down on the canyon country like a hand laid flat across the land. The kerosene lamp on her desk threw a warm, steady circle of gold across the open ledger, and she worked her way down the columns with the methodical satisfaction of someone who had long ago converted discipline into a form of contentment. 14 patients seen this month, 7 follow-up visits, 2 emergency calls, 3 outstanding accounts, all of which she had already mentally written off because the Hartley family had lost their milk cow to colic, and old Prentice was 81 years old and not likely to be settling debts from beyond the grave. And the Garza children had had whooping cough that summer, and their mother had looked so hollowed out by worry that Cecelia had not even presented the bill. She was not wealthy. She was, in fact, precisely calibrated on the narrow edge between sustainable and precarious, which was a condition she had come to regard as simply the natural state of a woman practicing medicine in a town of 412 souls in the canyon country of West Texas in the year 1887. Dustell did not readily accept a woman as its doctor. It had, over the decades since she had arrived with her father's black bag and her University of Pennsylvania certificate, and a determination so fierce it had frightened even herself, come to a grudging reliance on her. She had set bones and lanced infections, and delivered 31 babies, and sat with 4 people through their last hours on this earth. And still there were women in Dustell who referred to her as that Voss woman who plays at medicine as though a decade of competence were merely an extended pretense. She had long since stopped being wounded by it. She told herself this frequently enough that she almost believed it entirely. The first rumble of distant thunder shook the lamp flame. Cecelia looked up from her ledger and listened with the particular attentiveness of someone who had learned to read weather the way other people read faces. The rumble was low and sustained, which meant the cell was large. The wind had shifted in the last hour, coming now from the northwest, pushing the canyon air ahead of it like something being chased. She rose and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the glass, and watched the lightning branch across the far ridgeline in long, silent fractures. She thought with the clinical detachment she applied to most things that it was going to be a considerable storm. She did not think, because she had no reason to think it, that in approximately 40 minutes a man was going to knock on her door and alter the architecture of the rest of her life. She went back to her ledger. The rain arrived first as a scattered handful of drops that tapped against the window with an almost polite insistence, and then it arrived in full, a curtain of water so dense that it turned the single street of Dustell into a moving river within the first quarter hour. Cecelia watched it from her desk, her pen still in her hand, and felt the old familiar comfort of being inside when outside was doing its worst. The clinic was hers. Every board of it, every cabinet and shelf and carefully labeled jar had been earned through years of work that had sometimes felt like pressing her entire body against a wall that did not want to move. The kerosene lamp hissed softly. The rain drummed on the roof. Then, beneath the rain, she heard it. A sound that was not thunder and not wind. A deep, sustained roar from the direction of the canyon, low and relentless building, in the way that water builds when it has been given a channel and permission, and Cecelia set her pen down with a careful, precise movement and sat very still for 3 seconds. The creek had gone over its banks before. Twice in her 10 years here, it had risen to the lower edge of Main Street and frightened people considerably, and once it had taken out old Buford Crane's fence line and 3 of his horses along with it, which Buford had mourned considerably more than the fence. But the sound she was hearing now was not the sound of a creek remembering its power. It was the sound of the canyon itself, deciding it had been patient long enough. The bridge. She was on her feet before she had consciously made the decision to stand moving to the window with her lamp in her hand, and what she saw in the flickering blue-white of the lightning was a wall of brown water moving through the canyon below town with the slow grinding certainty of something that could not be argued with. The bridge, the single connection between Dustell and the county road, the only way in or out by anything wheeled, was gone. She caught one glimpse of a timber spinning in the current, and then the lightning faded, and there was only the rain and the roar. Dustell was an island. She stood at the window for a moment longer, her lamp throwing her reflection back at her, a thin woman in a practical gray dress with dark hair pinned up and steady, watchful eyes, and she noted the information with the same emotional register she applied to most facts that could not be changed. The bridge was gone. The town was isolated. In the morning there would be panic, and in the morning she would deal with it, because dealing with things was what she did. She went back to her desk. She had been seated perhaps 20 minutes. The rain still pounding the distant roar of the canyon, having settled into a continuous background thunder when the knock came. Not a knock precisely. A collision. 3 blows against her front door, so heavy and deliberate they seemed less like a request for entry and more like an announcement of inevitable consequence. The sound of something large and determined making itself known. Cecelia did not startle. She set down her pen, capped her ink bottle, and rose with the unhurried composure of a woman who had been woken at 2 a.m. by enough desperate knocks to have lost her capacity for being undone by them. She lifted her lamp and crossed the front room of the clinic, her heels clicking softly on the swept wooden floor, and she unlocked the door and opened it. The man standing on her porch was soaked through so thoroughly that the word soaked seemed entirely inadequate to describe his condition. He was broad-shouldered and powerfully built, the kind of physical presence that the landscape itself seemed to have produced, weathered and solid and unadorned by anything that was not strictly functional. His coat was dark with water. His hat still on his head with the stubborn persistence of a man who did not bow to weather, any more than he bowed to much else was streaming from its brim in a continuous curtain. His eyes, which were the color of flint or storm water or some other gray thing that had no patience for softness, found her face immediately and stayed there. He said, "I need a doctor." His voice was low and without inflection, the way a man's voice sounded when he had stripped it of everything he could not afford to spend. Cecelia regarded him for a moment. Behind her, the clinic was warm and orderly and completely hers. In front of her was a stranger standing in the worst storm in 3 years asking for something, and what struck her first was not fear, which she examined and found notably absent, but a cool professional curiosity. He was not drunk. He was not injured, not visibly. His eyes were fully focused, and his stance, though wet, was steady. Whatever had brought him to her door in the middle of the night, in the middle of a flood, was not about himself. "Who is the patient?" she said. It was not a question exactly. It was an inventory. She needed information before she could function the way she needed clean instruments and good light. "What are the symptoms? Where are they located?" The man held her gaze. He did not look away, and he did not answer, and the silence between them stretched long enough that the rain filled it entirely. A steady wall of sound on all sides, and Cecelia understood in that silence something she could not quite have articulated, which was that this man was not being evasive out of calculation. He was being silent the way a person was silent when the words available to them were insufficient for the risk involved, when speaking would cost more than he knew how to spend. She thought he is afraid, not of her, of the wrong word in the wrong place. She said, "I am not going to walk into the dark in this rain for a stranger without knowing what I am walking into." He said, "No." And then after a pause, "I understand that." And then he said nothing else. Cecelia looked at him standing in the rain that was stripping everything non-essential away, and she made a calculation she had not entirely expected to make. There was something about the quality of his silence, the way it did not demand or manipulate, but simply existed. A man reduced to his most fundamental state, asking for something he needed, with everything he had, except words that caught at something in her she had long since thought she had successfully anesthetized. It was not attraction, she told herself firmly. It was the medical instinct, the pull of a problem presenting itself, the trained recognition that somewhere in the dark there was someone who needed help, and this man, for reasons he could not safely speak, could not protect them by himself. She went to the back of the clinic. She lifted her medical bag from its hook beside the supply cabinet. It was a heavy bag, a sturdily made bag of dark leather that had been her father's, and before that, his father's, and she had added to it over the years until it contained everything she had learned to reach for in the difficult moments. She checked it without thinking, the way her hands knew to check it, running through the inventory by feel. Forceps suture thread surgical scissors, morphine laudanum, clean gauze. Rolled tight carbolic acid, a small bone saw she hoped never to use. She put on her oilskin coat. She settled her own hat on her head. She came back to the front door where the man was still standing, water running off him in steady streams, and she looked at him and said the only thing that mattered, since he was clearly not going to volunteer anything further, and she had already decided in the back room with her hands moving over the instruments in a way she was not entirely prepared to examine. Too closely. "How far?" she said. Something moved in his face. It was not relief exactly, not the effusive gratitude she had seen from frightened people before, which tended to make her uncomfortable precisely because she never knew what to do with it. It was something quieter, a loosening of something that had been held very tight. "South end of the livery," he said. 10 minutes. She stepped out into the rain. The storm was extraordinary. She had walked through rain before, many times had made night calls in weather that rational people would have stayed inside for, but this rain had a weight to it that was less like weather and more like submersion. The water was already an inch deep in the street running fast toward the lower end of town, and the lightning moved through the clouds above in constant rolling illumination that turned the mud silver and the puddles into mirrors. She kept her bag close to her side and walked with her head down and her eyes tracking the ground for sinkholes and debris, and the man whose name she still did not know walked a half-step behind and to her right in a way that felt deliberate. A positioning that she noted distantly put him between her and the wind. She did not mention it. She simply walked. The south end of the livery was technically a stretch of ground behind the last building on that side of Main Street, where the land opened up toward the canyon trail, and it was here, parked with the careful precision of someone who had thought about sightlines, that the wagon stood. It was not a new wagon. It had the particular shabbiness of something that had been maintained out of necessity for years beyond its intended lifespan, the canvas top patched in 3 places, the bed lower on one side where a wheel was settling into the wet ground. A lantern hung from the near side, protected from the rain by a piece of oilcloth tied over it, and its light fell in a small determined circle. The man went ahead of her and pulled back the canvas. Cecelia climbed in. The smell told her before the light could. She had spent enough time in sick rooms to read a space by its smell, the way a tracker read ground, and what she smelled was fever and infection, and the particular sweetness beneath both that indicated the infection had been present for days, not hours, and had progressed past the point where simple rest and time would address it. She lifted her own lantern and let the light fall. He was young, that was the first thing she registered, and it hit her the way the youth of patience always hit her, with a particular sharpness she had never managed to fully inoculate herself against. 18, perhaps 19 at the outside, with a face that would have been open and unguarded in health, but was now pulled tight with the particular grimace of someone whose body was fighting a battle they were not entirely conscious of. He was pale beneath the fever's flush, and his breathing was too fast, and his right arm, which had been wrapped in what had clearly once been a clean bandage, was now showing the unmistakable signs of a wound that had moved well past the reach of good intentions. Cecelia set her bag down and opened it without looking away from him. Her hands went to his pulse first, automatic, finding the beat at his throat and counting it silently, and it was fast and thin, which was the information she expected but did not want. Then she unwrapped the arm carefully, working the bandaging loose with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times, and when she saw what was beneath it, she did not allow herself any external reaction at all. The wound was a deep gash along the forearm, the kind of injury that came from something irregular and forceful, a fall onto machinery perhaps, or a confrontation with something metal and uncaring. It had been cleaned. She could see that cleaned and dressed by someone who had known enough to understand what cleaning a wound meant, but not soon enough, or not thoroughly enough, or simply too late. And the infection had taken hold with the thoroughness of something that had been given ideal conditions and time. The edges of the wound were hot and red, and the center was producing exactly what she did not want to see. She looked up. The man the stranger was crouched at the far end of the wagon, his wet coat dripping silently onto the boards, watching her with the absolute stillness of someone who had decided that the only useful thing he could do right now was stay out of her way. "He is your brother," she said. It was not a question. It was the shape of the thing she had read in his face when she had seen him look at the boy. "Yes," he said. "When did this happen?" 4 days ago. 4 days. She did the arithmetic quickly, the way she always did, the way the numbers steadied her when everything else was uncertain. 4 days meant the infection was established. Established meant it was aggressive. Aggressive meant that the next 24 hours were going to determine whether this boy kept his arm, and the 48 hours after that were going to determine something more significant than the arm. "His name," she said. A pause, then Eli. "And yours?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Holt." "All right," she said. She was already sorting through her bag, her hands finding the carbolic acid and the gauze and the forceps, arranging them in the order she would need them, her mind moving ahead of her hands through the steps of what had to be done tonight and what could wait until better light. "Holt, I need you to hold him still. He is going to fight this even unconscious people, fight debridement. I need his arm immobile, and I need it immobile for approximately 15 minutes without interruption. Can you do that?" He moved without a word to the boy's side and positioned himself with a quiet efficiency that told her he had already thought through where to be before she asked. And that information settled something in her without her entirely approving of its settling. She did not need it to settle. She needed him to be useful, which he was proposing to be, and that was the entirety of what was relevant right now. She worked. The rain hammered the wagon's patched canvas, and the lantern threw its small, steady light, and Cecilia's hands moved through the work of debridement with the focused precision she brought to everything she did, and the boy Eli flinched and struggled, and once called out something that was not quite a word, and each time Holt held him, not roughly, but with the implacable steadiness of someone who understood that this was the cost of saving the arm. He did not wince at the smell of it. He did not look away. He held his brother with the deliberate care of someone treating broken things. Cecelia noticed this and filed it away and did not examine it further. She was finishing the initial cleaning, her hands aching from the grip of the instruments, her eyes strained in the unsteady light when she reached for the cloth she had set at the near edge of the wagon board and found it gone. She looked up, and Holt was holding out a fresh cloth, clean and slightly damp, with something that was not water. She smelled it a half-second before she took it from him. Peppermint oil, sharp and clean, the smell cutting through the sickness smell of the wagon like a window opened in a closed room. She had not told him to bring peppermint oil. She had not mentioned it. She had not mentioned it because there were 37 things she needed, and she had not yet gotten to the part of the process where that particular need arose. And yet here it was in his hand, extended to her without fanfare, without any indication that he expected acknowledgment for having known to have it ready. She took the cloth. She finished her work. She said when she had done what could be done tonight, "I need to come back in the morning with additional supplies. The debridement is not complete." He said, "All right." She said, "He needs to stay still and stay warm. If his fever spikes further in the night, wet a cloth with the coolest water you can find and lay it on his forehead. Do not put it on his chest. Do not try to move him." He said, "All right." She began packing her bag. She was aware as she worked of a peculiar quality to the quiet in the wagon, which was not the uncomfortable quiet of strangers, but something she did not have an easy name for. She was also aware underneath that awareness of the fact that he had not at any point in the evening asked her to keep a secret, had not asked her for her discretion, had not presented her with a story designed to make his situation sound less alarming than it was. He had asked for a doctor, and he had gotten out of her way, and he had had peppermint oil ready. She climbed out of the wagon into the still pounding rain. She had a 15-minute walk back to the clinic through water that was now running stronger. She settled her bag on her shoulder and turned toward the street. Behind her she heard nothing. He had not followed her out. He was still in the wagon with his brother, maintaining exactly the position she had told him to maintain, doing exactly what she had told him to do, and she walked back through the flooding street in the middle of the night, thinking despite all of her careful intentions about a man who had peppermint oil ready before she asked for it. She returned to her clinic. She hung up her wet coat. She sat down at her desk in front of the open ledger, and she looked at the numbers for a long moment, and then she looked instead at the cabinet in the far corner of the room. The blue silk dress was visible through the cabinet's glass door, hanging where it had hung for 10 years, unworn, a monument to a night she had spent a decade trying to stop thinking about. She had been 24 years old and newly arrived in Dustell, and foolish enough to still believe in the particular variety of hope that involved standing near a punch bowl in a new dress, and the man she had arrived hoping to see had looked through her with the cheerful indifference of someone who had simply never thought about her at all. She had not worn the dress since. She had not thrown it away, either. It hung there the way certain memories hung, too specific to forget, too ordinary to qualify as a scar. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed the ledger and went to bed. In the morning she rose before first light and made her preparations with the methodical care she applied to all things that mattered. She replenished her bag with what the night had used and added what the morning would require. She put on her second-best dress, the dark blue wool that was practical and unremarkable, and she told herself as she did the telling with some regularity that she was going back to that wagon, because there was a young man with an infected wound who needed a doctor, and the entirety of her interest in the situation was medical and nothing else. She might be thinking at the edges of her thoughts, in the parts of her mind she was currently managing not to examine, was relevant to that central and organizing fact. She went out into the morning. The storm had not stopped. It had settled perhaps from its midnight peak into something more sustainable, a steady, relentless rain that had turned the canyon country into a landscape of running water. The street was still flowing. The smell of wet earth and rock was very strong. She could hear the creek distantly still running high and fast, and the absence of the sound of the bridge, which had always produced a particular low vibration in flood conditions, registered in her body, the way the absence of a familiar thing always did, as a small, persistent note of wrongness. She made her way to the wagon. Holt was not inside. Cecelia stopped at the back of the wagon and looked in, and Eli was there, sleeping with the slightly improved color of someone whose fever had not worsened overnight, and the cloth on his forehead was exactly where she had said to put it damp and cool. Everything she had left in the arrangement, she had left it in. Holt was simply not there. She climbed in and began her morning examination, checking the wound, checking the pulse, checking the boy's eyes, when she lifted one lid briefly to assess the response. He was holding. He was not improving, not yet, but he was holding, which was the word she used in her own mind when a patient was in the space between getting worse and getting better, that narrow, precarious corridor that required attention and skill, and if she was being honest, a certain amount of will on the part of the patient that no physician could provide for them. She heard something behind the wagon, a sound she identified after a moment as a man sitting down in mud. She finished her examination and climbed back out. Holt was sitting on the ground on the far side of the wagon wheel, his back against the wheels, spoke his knees up, his hat pulled down. He was in the rain. He was simply sitting in it, not as a man sits in the rain when he is looking for shelter and failing to find it, not with any suggestion of suffering or endurance, or the particular hunched quality of someone waiting for something better to happen. He was sitting in the rain, the way a rock sat in the rain, a fact of the landscape that the rain was simply moving around without complaint. Cecelia stood and looked at him. She had treated men for 20 years. She had sat with men in grief and men in fear and men in the particular shame that injury sometimes produced in people who had organized their whole lives around the premise of their own invulnerability. She had seen men perform suffering for her consciously or not reaching for her response. She had seen men minimize suffering in ways that cost them their health. She had seen so many varieties of the way men related to pain and extremity that she had come to believe she had catalogued most of them. She had not catalogued this. This was a man who was sitting in the rain because he could not be with his brother right now. The cabin space too small for both of them when a doctor was working, and he was not performing discomfort, and he was not minimizing it. He was simply existing in the conditions that existed without asking for anything different. She looked at him for a moment. Then she climbed back into the wagon to prepare the next phase of treatment, taking the image of him sitting in the mud with her, settling it somewhere in the back of her mind, where she was going to have to think about it later in the quiet, when she could look at it honestly. She had looked at a man, not a problem, and she had not looked away. Outside, the rain continued its long, patient work. Somewhere below the town, the canyon ran full, and the world stayed beautifully, terrifyingly cut off. And in a patched wagon at the south end of Dustell, a young man called Eli continued the quiet, enormous work of surviving while his doctor sat beside him and tried with only partial success to think about nothing except medicine. The smell of the wound told her everything she needed to know before her hands confirmed it. Cecelia had been in the wagon for 3 hours by the time the morning light gray and waterlogged found its way through the gap in the canvas, and her hands were stained past the wrists in a way that would require serious attention with the carbolic soap before she touched another patient. She sat back on her heels and looked at the boy at Eli, who had slipped into the shallow, restless sleep of someone whose body was spending everything it had on a single concentrated effort, and she made herself say the thing she had been turning over since the first light had shown her exactly how far the infection had progressed overnight. She turned toward the canvas opening. Holt. He was there immediately, which meant he had been close, which meant he had not gone back to sleep after she had arrived, which meant he had been sitting in proximity to the wagon in the rain for the entirety of the 3 hours she had been working inside it. She filed this information away without comment and focused on his face, which was watchful and contained, and offered her nothing she had not put there with her own words. "I need you to understand what I am about to tell you," she said, "and I need you to understand it clearly without the part of your mind that wants to argue with it getting in the way." He said nothing. He was watching her with the particular quality of attention she had come to associate with him in the 12 hours since he had appeared on her porch, which was the quality of a man who understood that listening was not passive. Without full surgical debridement complete and thorough within the next 48 hours, she said, "Your brother will not keep the arm. And if the infection advances the way infections of this type advance, when they are not fully addressed, the arm will not be the only thing we lose." She watched him receive this. She watched the information move through him the way a strong current moved through something anchored a deep, invisible stress on a structure that did not visibly bend. His jaw tightened a single degree. His eyes, which were already the color of something hard, became harder. Then he said, "What do you need?" Not "are you certain," not "is there another way." Not the catalog of panicked questions she had heard from frightened people 100 times, the questions that were really just grief trying to find a different door. He asked what she needed, which was the only question that moved anything forward, and she had her answer ready because she had spent the 3 hours preparing it. "More supplies than I have in this bag," she said. "I need to go back to the clinic. I need to bring back what I need for a full surgical debridement under these conditions, and I need to do it before the afternoon, because his fever is holding at a level that will not hold indefinitely." "Go," he said. She climbed out of the wagon into the rain which had settled overnight, into the determined, steady kind that intended to continue for some time without particular drama. The street was still moving water, though the level had dropped slightly from the midnight peak, and the air had the clean, washed smell of a landscape that was being thoroughly reorganized. She walked with her bag over her shoulder and her coat buttoned to the throat, and she thought as she walked about the 48 hours ahead, and what they required, and what she had, and what she would need to improvise. She did not think about the fact that he had not asked her to keep the secret. She thought about it anyway. Every patient she had treated in 10 years with something to hide, something shameful or illegal or simply private, had made some effort to secure her discretion. They had appealed to her professional ethics, or they had offered payment, or they had made the request explicitly in the way of people who understood transactions. Holt Maddox had done none of these things. He had brought her to his brother and stepped out of her way, and had peppermint oil ready, and he had not said a single word about what she should or should not tell anyone. She could not decide if this represented an extraordinary confidence in her judgment or an extraordinary carelessness about consequences, and she found that she could not quite make the two possibilities feel equally likely. She reached the clinic, let herself in, and moved through the familiar space with the efficiency of someone operating on organized memory. Pulling from the supply cabinet the instruments she had not brought the night before, the larger forceps, the cleaner cutting tools, the additional suture thread, the 2 remaining vials of chloroform she kept for surgical situations. She laid everything on the examination table and went through it with the focused attention of a woman preparing for a battle with a known enemy on a specific timeline. She was counting sutures when the knock came at the front door. She paused. Morning callers were not unusual, but the rhythm of this knock was familiar in the particular way of neighbors who had something to say rather than patients who had something hurting, and she took a breath and went to the door, and found, as she had half expected, Martha Greer from the dry goods, who was formidably built and relentlessly curious, and had appointed herself in Cecilia's estimation as something between the town's social secretary and its primary news distribution service. "Cecelia," Martha said, and her eyes went immediately to the instruments on the examination table behind Cecilia's shoulder with the speed of a woman whose peripheral vision had been professionally developed. "We saw you going out last night, in that rain, toward the south end." Cecelia looked at her. "I had a patient," she said. "The drifter's wagon," Martha said, and the word drifter carried in it everything Martha thought she needed to communicate about the situation, which was considerable. "I had a patient," Cecelia said again with the particular repetitive simplicity she had perfected over years of interactions with people who wanted her information more than they wanted her meaning. "Who requires follow-up care? If you will excuse me, Martha, I have preparations to complete." She closed the door. She stood for a moment behind the closed door with her hand on the latch and looked at the middle distance and noted without particular alarm that the social infrastructure of Dustell was already engaged. The bridge was out, which meant that everyone in town was pinned in place with nothing to do but watch each other, and she had been seen walking to a stranger's wagon in the middle of the night, in the worst storm in 3 years, and by noon the shape of the story would have been established whether or not the facts supported it. She picked up her replenished bag and went back out into the rain. Eli was conscious when she returned. Not fully conscious, not the clear-eyed alertness of health, but that swimming intermittent consciousness of high fever, where the world arrived in pieces, and none of the pieces quite connected. He was looking at the wagon's patched canvas ceiling when she climbed in, his lips moving occasionally in the way of someone holding a conversation with a room that was not there. And when Cecelia leaned over him and said his name clearly and directly, he focused on her with the laborious effort of someone pushing through deep water. "Doctor," he said with the slight surprise of someone who had not expected to say it. "Yes," she said. "I am going to work on your arm now. This is going to be uncomfortable, and I need you to stay as still as you can." He said with a strange sideways dignity that delirious people sometimes produced, "I can do that." She looked at him for a moment. He had a young man's face, the kind of face that had not yet finished deciding what it intended to be, and beneath the fever's drawing there was something in it that she could see would in health be easy and open. She thought of him at 18 healthy, before whatever had brought him and his brother to a patched wagon in a flooded West Texas town, and she found the thought produced in her the particular professional tenderness she felt for patients whose circumstances were beyond what they had earned. "I know you can," she said. She looked up at Holt, who had positioned himself again without being directed opposite her, one hand already resting gently on his brother's uninjured shoulder. She began. Surgical debridement was not by any reasonable measure a pleasant thing to observe or to endure. Cecelia had long since made her peace with the fact that the work that saved people was sometimes the work that looked to the uninitiated most like harm, and she worked with the steady, focused efficiency of a physician who understood that hesitation was its own form of cruelty. She moved through the procedure with precision, cleaning the wound thoroughly, removing what needed to be removed, creating the conditions that would allow healing to take the path she was directing it toward. Eli bore it with a courage that was partly delirium and partly, she thought, something intrinsic. He thrashed twice his body's reflexive protest at the pain it was registering without his conscious permission, and both times Holt held him with the precise calibrated force of someone who understood the difference between restraint and cruelty, and both times Eli's struggle subsided back into something manageable. The second time it happened, Cecelia was at a particularly delicate point in the cleaning, and she reached without looking toward where she had laid the fresh gauze and found that it was not there. Her hand swept the space once, a quick automatic check, and then she looked up, and Holt was extending the gauze to her with his free hand, his other hand still steady on his brother's shoulder, his eyes on the wound rather than her face, tracking the work with the calm attention of someone learning rather than performing. She took the gauze. She finished. When she had done what the morning permitted, she sat back and looked at the wound, which was cleaner than it had been, which was not the same as clean, and made the calculation she had been making since she woke up. The 48 hours were running. The wagon was not a sterile environment. The rain was not going to stop, and even if it did, the wood of the wagon boards was wet. Now the canvas had its own population of things she did not want near an open wound, and the whole arrangement, which had been barely acceptable as an emergency measure, was becoming less acceptable by the hour. She began packing her instruments with the methodical care she gave to things that had just earned renewed respect for what they could do. She climbed out of the wagon and stood in the rain for a moment, and Holt came out behind her. He stood beside the wagon with the rain running off the brim of his hat, and he looked at her with the flat, clear attention of a man waiting for the next piece of information. And Cecelia looked back at him and found herself, not for the first time since the previous midnight in the experience of not quite knowing what to do with a person who asked for exactly what they needed and nothing more. "How is he?" Holt said. "Holding," she said. "But the conditions here are not adequate for what comes next. I need him in my clinic where I have clean surfaces and proper light, and the ability to monitor him through the night without spending the night in a wagon." Something shifted in his face. It was not an argument, and it was not agreement. It was the face of a man absorbing a new complexity that he had not previously accounted for. "Your clinic," he said. "In town." "In town," she said. The silence that followed was not long, but it was heavy with everything neither of them said, which was that bringing Eli Maddox into her clinic in a town of 400 souls that was currently isolated and at loose ends and already watching the south end of the livery with the focused attention of people with too much time and too little distraction was not a simple proposition. It was a proposition that attached her name to his in a way that would be noticed and interpreted and narrated in the dry goods and the post office and across back fences for the foreseeable future. "Not yet," she said, and she heard in her own voice the precision of someone drawing a line in a particular place for a particular reason. "The bleeding needs to stop completely first, and I need to see another 24 hours of temperature stability. When those conditions are met, we move him." Holt looked at her. "You will tell me when." "I will tell you when," she said. She walked back toward the clinic through the rain, and she did not let herself think about the conversation she had just had, or the decision it contained, not yet, not until she was through her own door and the bag was hanging on its hook and the instruments were soaking in the carbolic solution. Then she stood at her wash basin and scrubbed her hands and thought about it with the careful, direct honesty she tried to apply to things that mattered. She was going to bring a stranger of unknown situation and almost certainly complicated history into her clinic in front of the entire stranded population of Dustell, and she was going to do it because the alternative was watching a 19-year-old boy lose his arm or his life to an infection that she had the skill and the equipment to address, and no other calculation was relevant. She looked at her clean hands in the basin. She thought about Martha Greer's eyes going to the instruments on the table. She thought about the word drifter and the weight it had been given. She dried her hands. She went back to her desk and opened her ledger and added the morning's entry with the same careful hand she used for all the others, the date and the patient and the procedure and the supply usage. And she wrote Eli Maddox's name in her own clinic record for the first time and felt in the writing of it the particular clarity that came from having already made the decision that mattered and needing only to live into its consequences. The afternoon brought a change in the rain, lighter, more variable, and with it the sounds of Dustell reconstituting itself after the crisis of the previous night. She could hear voices from the direction of the post office, which was where news traveled in Dustell, and once she heard the raised voice of Tom Bickle, the blacksmith expressing strong opinions about something she could not quite make out, which was typical of Tom Bickle, and not, she thought, necessarily about her. She went to the wagon at mid-afternoon with fresh supplies and found Eli sleeping more deeply, which was a good sign, the sleep of someone whose body had decided it could afford to rest rather than the sleep of someone who was losing the fight for consciousness. His temperature was still elevated but had not climbed, which was the best she could have asked for at this stage. She changed the dressings with the clean technique that she maintained even in the wagon, because technique was not a thing you adjusted based on convenience. It was the thing you held to precisely when convenience was not available. Holt sat across from her through the procedure. He did not attempt conversation, which she had come to recognize as his default state, and which she had also come to recognize, though she was still somewhat cautious about admitting this even to herself, as something she found unexpectedly comfortable. She had spent so much of her professional life managing other people's need to fill silence, the patients who talked through pain to distance themselves from it, the family members who asked questions in order to participate, that a person who was simply present without requiring anything of the air between them was a kind of relief she had not known she was tired enough to need. She was finishing the redressing when Eli's eyes opened more clearly this time and found her face. "It hurts less," he said with the faint surprise of someone reporting something that is actually true. "It will hurt more before it hurts less again," she told him, because she did not believe in comfortable lies about recovery. "But the fact that the quality of the pain has changed is a good sign." He absorbed this. Then he looked past her at Holt with the slightly unfocused affection of someone who was only partly in the room and said, "She is mean." Cecelia looked at him. "She is keeping you alive," Holt said from behind her, and there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it, some warmth that had been heated down to its densest form, and Cecelia turned her face away from both of them and organized the contents of her bag so that neither of them would see whatever was happening on her face. She left the wagon at the early evening and walked back toward the clinic with the gray light settling around the canyon country in the particular soft way of stormy evenings when the sky was too full of cloud for a proper sunset, but produced instead a diffuse silver illumination that made even the muddy street look briefly beautiful. She stood for a moment at the front of her clinic with her bag in her hand and looked at the street. The post office light was on. She could see two silhouettes through the window. Someone had strung a lantern on the post outside the dry goods against the damp dark, and its light made an orange circle on the wet boards of the front step. It was an ordinary town evening, the kind she had spent 1,000 of, and she was standing in it with a secret tucked inside her that was going to get harder to carry before it got easier. And she found that this knowledge produced in her not the dread she might have expected, but something that was uncomfortably closer to the feeling of being alive in a way she had not been alive in some time. She went inside. She made tea. She sat at her desk. She did not open the ledger. She was sitting in the quiet with her tea going cool in her hand when the knock came, and it was not the specific knock of emergency that she had learned to hear in her sleep, so she rose without urgency and went to the door and opened it. A boy of about 12 stood on her porch with his forearm tucked against his chest in the specific way of someone who had done something to it and was in the process of deciding how to feel about that. He looked up at her with the wide-eyed assessment of a child encountering the doctor and not yet certain whether that was a rescue or a sentence. "Ma'am," he said, "Mama says my arm might be broke." Cecelia looked at his arm and then at his face. "Come in, Lon," she said. The arm was not broken. It was a sprain. A moderately serious one, the kind that came from a fall onto an outstretched hand, and she wrapped it with the clean efficiency that came from having wrapped a very great many sprained wrists, and told him to stay off it for a week, and sent him home with the particular instruction that if the swelling increased rather than decreased in the next 24 hours, he was to come back immediately. He left with the visible relief of someone whose worst fear had been addressed and replaced with a manageable reality, and Cecelia closed the door behind him and stood in the quiet clinic, and felt for the first time that day the straightforward satisfaction of a thing done well and simply. This was why she had come to Dustell 10 years ago. Not for the social approval she had never fully received, not for the community standing that had always been conditional and slightly withheld. For this. For a 12-year-old boy who came in holding his arm funny and left knowing it would be all right. She was still holding that satisfaction, turning it over in the quiet, when the sound began. It started as nothing she could immediately classify, a change in the air of the wagon's direction rather than a sound precisely. And then it resolved into something she recognized from the particular educational horror of her training years, the rapid, irregular movement of a body in the specific distress of convulsive activity, and she was already moving before the thought had fully formed. She grabbed her bag from its hook. She ran. The rain had picked up again. She ran through it without the oilskin, without the hat, without any of the careful, practical preparations she normally made, before stepping outside into weather, because the timeline in her head was running very fast, and the arithmetic of convulsion and infection and a body already under extreme stress did not allow for coat. She reached the wagon and climbed in, and Holt was already on the far side of his brother, his hands on Eli's shoulders, not restraining but steadying, and Eli was in the grip of something that was taking up the entirety of his body and leaving very little of him available for anything else. Cecelia went to work. The convulsion lasted a minute and 47 seconds, which she counted with the cold precision of professional function, and when it ended, and Eli lay limp and drenched in the aftermath of it, she checked his pulse and checked his breathing and checked his wound, and sat back on her heels with the full weight of the next decision settling onto her. She looked at Holt. "We cannot stay in this wagon," she said. "Not for another night. The infection is driving the convulsion. He needs my clinic. He needs my equipment and my clean surfaces and my ability to monitor him through every hour of the night." Holt looked at his brother and then at her, and she saw in his face the acknowledgment of what she had not said, which was that this was going to be visible and public and permanent in the way of things that were done openly in small towns, and that she was the one who would carry the weight of it after they were gone. She held his gaze. Outside the rain came down steady and indifferent. "In the morning," she said, "we move him." And the two of them sat in the yellow lamplight with the unconscious boy between them and the storm pressing in from all sides, and Cecelia felt beneath the clinical resolve and the professional certainty the particular irreversible feeling of a woman who has gone too far to turn back and has discovered with some surprise that she does not want to. She did not sleep. Cecelia sat at her desk through the remaining hours of the night with her ledger open and her pen in her hand, and did not write a single entry, because what was in her head was not the kind of thing that went into ledgers. The lamp burned down to its last quarter, and she trimmed it without thinking, and it burned down again, and she let it go, sitting in the dimming light, with the sound of the rain on the roof, and the sound of her own thinking, which was louder than either. She was going to move Eli Maddox into her clinic in the morning. She turned this fact over the way she turned difficult diagnoses over, looking at each face of it in succession, the medical face, which was clean and simple and entirely justified, the professional face, which was slightly more complicated, but still defensible, and the personal face, which was the one she kept returning to, despite her best efforts to leave it alone. The personal face was the one that said, "You are not doing this only for the boy, and you know it, and the knowing is something you are going to have to look at eventually." She looked at it now, in the last of the lamplight, with the particular honesty that the middle of the night sometimes demanded. She was going to walk down the main street of Dustell in broad daylight, with her most conspicuous surgical instruments, and she was going to step into that wagon in front of every stranded, gossip-hungry soul in this town, and she was going to make visible what had been hidden, and she was going to do it because a boy needed her clinic. That was true. It was also true that when Holt had looked at her in the wagon with his brother, convulsing between them, and had not said a single word about what she was risking, something in her had settled in a way that felt less like surrender and more like the feeling of finally standing on solid ground after a very long time on shifting terrain. She closed the ledger. She went to bed. She lay in the dark for a while, and then she slept. She woke before first light, with the particular clarity of someone whose mind had continued working through the night and had arrived at a destination without her conscious participation. She rose and washed her face and dressed with care, not the second-best wool, but her good black dress, the one she wore when she wanted to communicate to a room that she was not open to being questioned about her decisions. She pinned her hair with the same precision she applied to sutures. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin and saw a woman who had made up her mind. She went to her supply cabinet and opened it fully. The instruments she needed for the transfer were not subtle. The surgical kit in its leather roll, the full chloroform case, the large forceps set that she used for serious debridement, the stand-mounted lamp she used for procedures requiring more light than a kerosene lamp on a table could provide its base alone the size of a cooking pot. She laid them out on the examination table and looked at them with the clear eyes of someone doing an inventory rather than a performance. Anyone who saw her carry these items through the street would know exactly what they meant. There was no arrangement that made them look like something other than what they were, the tools of a physician preparing for serious surgical work, and any person in Dustell who had ever spent 5 minutes near sickness or injury would be able to read them correctly. She packed them anyway. She packed them with the methodical, unhurried care she gave to all preparations that mattered, nested and secured and distributed in her 2 bags, and the small flat case she used for the lamp components, and when everything was packed, she put on her coat and her hat, and she picked up the bags and the case, and she went out the front door into the morning. The rain had lightened overnight to the kind that felt more like a sustained mist. The air so saturated with water that the difference between rain and not rain was largely philosophical. The street was still soft, still running in places where the ground had given up trying to absorb anything more. The morning light was the pale, flat gray of a sky that had been overcast so long it had forgotten the alternative. There were people out. This was not a surprise. The bridge was still impassable, which meant another day of isolation, and isolated people in small towns had the particular energy of those who had run out of their own business to attend to and had moved on to everyone else's. She could see from her porch that the post office had a cluster of 3 people outside it, despite the mist, which was notable, because the post office had no deliveries to offer, and the cluster was therefore present for other reasons entirely. She could see a figure at the window of the dry goods that was almost certainly Martha Greer. She could see Tom Bickle standing on the step of his blacksmith shop with his arms crossed, which was his resting posture for witnessing things he intended to have opinions about later. Cecelia stepped off her porch and walked down the main street. She walked at her normal pace, which was direct and unhurried, the pace of a woman who moved through her days with purpose rather than performance. She held both bags in her left hand and the instrument case in her right, and she did not look at the post office cluster or the dry goods window or Tom Bickle's crossed arms. She looked at the street ahead of her, at the mud and the puddles and the familiar imperfect boards of the sidewalk where it existed, and the open ground where it did not, and she walked. She heard the conversations pause. It was not a dramatic silencing, not the theatrical hush of a saloon when a stranger enters, just the natural interruption that occurred when something more interesting than the current subject appeared in a person's field of vision. She heard the pause and then the resumption at a lower register, the particular cadence of people talking about what they were watching while they were watching it, and she felt it on her skin the way she felt weather as a pressure and a temperature, something to be noted and moved through. She kept walking. The south end of the livery came into view, and she saw the wagon, and she saw Holt. He was standing outside the wagon with his coat on, his hat straight, his stance, the particular kind of still that she had come to recognize as his version of readiness, not tense, but fully present, all of him available for whatever came next. He watched her come down the street, and when she was close enough to see his face, she saw something in it that she had not expected and was not entirely sure how to categorize. He was watching her walk toward him through the stares of the whole stranded town, with her surgical instruments in both hands and her head level, and the thing she saw in his face was not relief and not gratitude, and not even the particular focused attention he gave to most things. It was something quieter than all of those, something that looked like a man watching a thing that surprised him, and did not try to look like it had not. She stopped in front of him. He said nothing. He simply looked at her and then just briefly looked past her toward the cluster of observers at the post office end of the street, and she saw in that glance the full weight of his understanding of what she had just done, what it cost, what it would continue to cost. Then he looked back at her. His eyes offered her an out. This was the only way she could describe it to herself later. A genuine, undemanding out, the look of a man saying with no words at all that he understood, if she stopped here, that he would not hold it against her, that there was still a turn to make, if she wanted to make it. Cecelia looked back at him. Then she stepped past him and climbed into the wagon. Eli was awake, more awake than he had been since the night she first saw him, the fever having dropped a degree or more in the early morning hours, which was the development she had hoped for, and cautiously built her morning plan around. He looked at her with the clearer eyes of someone who was actually present in the room, and she could see in his expression the nascent awareness of a young man beginning to understand the dimensions of his own situation. "We are moving you," she told him, settling her bags with the efficiency of someone working on a timeline. "To my clinic. It is a 10-minute carry in a litter if you stay still and do not try to help. The trying to help will slow us down and exhaust you and cost you approximately 4 hours of recovery. So you are going to lie still and let us do the work." He looked at her and then past her at Holt with the particular expression of a younger sibling who has been given instructions by an authority figure and is looking to an older one for confirmation that the instructions are as firm as advertised. "She means it," Holt said from behind her. Eli looked back at Cecelia. "All right," he said. She had constructed the litter the previous evening from the boards she kept in the clinic storeroom for exactly this kind of transfer planks that her father had taught her to keep, because the moment you needed a litter and did not have one was the moment you understood why you should always have one. She had brought the components in the flat case, and she assembled them now with the quick competence of a woman who had done it before, and when it was ready, she directed the transfer with the same clean authority she applied to all procedures. Moving a patient from a wagon litter to a stretcher carry was not a delicate operation, but it was a precise one, and she talked them through each step, telling Holt where to hold and where not to hold, and how to lift and at what angle. And he followed her instructions with the focused attention of someone who understood that following instructions precisely was its own form of competence. And between the two of them they moved Eli from the wagon boards to the litter without once putting stress on the injured arm. Eli, for his part, stayed still. He closed his eyes and breathed and stayed still. which was Cecelia thought the most useful thing he could have done, and more than a great many adult men in similar circumstances managed. Then they carried him out into the mist and into the street. The walk back through the main street of Dustell with Eli on the litter was in the scale of Cecilia's 10 years. In this town, one of the more significant things she had done in public. She was aware of this with a clarity that was not quite discomfort and not quite pride, but was in the territory of both the particular sensation of being fully visible in a way she could not moderate or manage. She held her end of the litter, and she walked, and Holt walked at the other end, and between them Eli lay with his eyes closed and his breathing steady, and the street watched. She heard nothing specific. That was, she thought afterward, the most interesting part. She had braced herself for something, some comment, some pointed observation from the direction of the post office, some version of Martha Greer's arch and knowing tone. What she received instead was silence, the silence of people watching something they had not fully decided how to interpret, and she moved through it with her head level and her grip on the litter steady and her pace exactly what it had been since she left the clinic the first time. They reached the front of the clinic. She went up the 2 steps first, adjusting the litter angle to compensate for the change in elevation, and Holt followed her lead without prompting. And they brought Eli through the front door and down the short passage to the back room where Cecelia had prepared the bed the evening before with the clean sheets and the bolster positioning that would keep the arm correctly elevated. They settled him onto the bed. Cecelia straightened and looked at the room, at the clean white of the sheets, and the orderly arrangement of the instruments on the side table, and the good lamp already positioned at the angle she needed. This was her space. This was the space she had built over 10 years from nothing, and in it she was entirely competent and entirely herself, and the knowledge of that moved through her as she stood looking at her patient in her own clean room like something long contracted finally expanding to its proper size. She began her examination. Eli bore it with the improved stoicism of someone who had graduated from delirium to the merely uncomfortable, which was progress of the most practical kind. His temperature was down to a level that was still elevated, but no longer in the range that produced convulsions, and the wound in the clean light of her clinic, rather than a swinging wagon lantern, was showing the early signs of responding to the debridement. The edges were still angry, but the specific quality of the anger had changed, the red retreating very slightly from the center, the discharge losing some of its most alarming characteristics. She would need to operate again. She had known this. But the window for doing it with the highest chance of success had shifted from immediate to this afternoon, which was an improvement measured in hours that felt in the current context like a considerable gift. She told him what she was going to do and when and why in the direct and specific way she told all her patients, because she had found that people bore difficult things better when they knew the shape of what they were bearing, and he listened with the focused attention of a young man who was, despite everything, fundamentally interested in the world and his continued presence in it. "Will it work?" he asked when she had finished. She looked at him. "It has a very good chance of working," she said, "which is not the same as a guarantee. I do not make guarantees. I make honest assessments, and I do excellent work, and then we see what the body decides." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Holt said you were the best doctor in the county." Cecelia paused in the middle of organizing her instrument tray. "Holt said that," she said. "Night before last," Eli said, "when I was clearer. He said he had asked around before he knocked on your door." She set down the instrument she was holding and looked at her tray for a moment. Then she picked it up again and continued her arrangement, because the alternative was standing still, and she did not currently trust standing still. "Get some rest," she said. "I will begin at 2." She went to the front room. Holt was there. He had taken up a position near the window, not sitting, simply standing near it with his hands at his sides, and the mist light came through the glass and made the planes of his face look like something carved by a patient and unsentimental hand. She said, "The surgery is this afternoon, 2 o'clock. I will need you to assist, as you have been assisting." He said, "I will be here." She went to her desk. She opened the medical supply ledger and began updating it, entering the supplies, used the supplies remaining the projected needs for the afternoon procedure, and she did this with the steady hand of someone organizing their resources for a continued campaign, and the routine of it grounded her the way routine always did in the specific and the manageable. He did not leave. He stayed near the window. He was not in her way, and he did not attempt conversation, and she found that she was not bothered by his presence in her clinic the way she might have expected to be bothered, the way she was bothered by most uninvited presences in her space. He occupied the room with the same quality he occupied the wagon and the rainy ground beside it, simply there, simply present, not requiring anything of the air around him. She had been writing for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard it. A soft, barely perceptible sound from the direction of the wall, and she looked up and saw Holt crouched beside the baseboard near the window, his fingers running along a gap in the plaster that had been admitting a draft since the previous February. He had at some point in the last 20 minutes found a small piece of rags from somewhere she had not seen him access, and he was pressing it carefully into the gap with the focused attention of a man performing a task that simply needed doing. She watched him for a moment. He did not look up. He finished the pressing and ran his finger along the edge to check the seal, and then rose and returned to his position by the window, and the draft that had been threading through that wall since February was gone. She looked at the baseboard for a moment, and then she looked at her ledger, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not make the moment into something it did not need to be made into. The surgery that afternoon was the most demanding thing she had done in the clinic in 2 years. The procedure lasted 90 minutes and required every tool she had laid out and 2 that she had not initially planned to use, and there was a period of approximately 11 minutes in the middle of it where the outcome genuinely hung in the balance. And she worked in complete silence, her entire self focused to a single point. And Holt held the lamp at exactly the angle she had directed, without moving it by so much as a degree for the full duration. When it was done, she stepped back and looked at the wound, and made the assessment that was available to her, which was cautiously, carefully qualified as good. It was as good as it could be. It was as good as she could make it. She became aware in the relative silence after the procedure that her hands were trembling. Not much. Not the trembling of fear or collapse, but the fine post-adrenaline trembling that she knew well from the aftermath of procedures that had required her to be very steady for a very long time, the body's delayed acknowledgement that it had been held under significant tension, and was now permitted to register the fact. She turned away from the patient bed and began organizing the used instruments with her back to the room, and she worked to steady herself through the familiar motion. She heard Holt move. She heard the small sound of the stove in the corner, the lift of the heavy kettle she kept on it, and then the particular sound of a cup being set on a hard surface, and then his footsteps behind her. He set the cup on the supply table beside her right hand. It was coffee. The coffee she had made that morning, still warm because the stove had been running through the surgery for heat, and it was exactly as she took it, which she had not told him, and which meant he had paid attention at some point when she was unaware of being observed. She reached for the cup. His hand covered hers, not with force, not with the presumption of someone claiming territory. Just large and steady and warm, laid over her trembling hands with the same precise, deliberate quality he brought to everything, as if he had decided to do this and had done it fully. She went still. She did not pull her hand away. She did not look up. She stood with her hands around the warm cup and his hand covering both of hers, and she breathed once, and the trembling slowed. They stood like that for perhaps 10 seconds. Then the knock came. It was the front door, 3 heavy blows, and it had an official quality to it that she recognized immediately, the knock of someone who expected the door to open and was accustomed to that expectation being met. Cecelia lifted her head. She set the cup down. She moved toward the front room, and she did not look at Holt, and he did not try to stop her. She had almost reached the front door when it came again, the same 3 blows, slightly heavier this time, and she opened the door with the composed expression of a woman receiving a caller at a time of her own choosing. The man on her porch was broad and florid, wearing the county sheriff's badge with the particular self-awareness of someone who attached considerable importance to having it, and he had the eyes of a man who had been stranded in Dustell for 2 days by a flood with nothing to do, and had been organizing his observations into something he intended to act on. He said, "Dr. Voss." He made her title sound like a courteous concession. "Sheriff," she said. He looked past her into the front room of the clinic with the particular brand of casual examination that was designed to look incidental and was in fact anything but. "Here you've been treating someone," he said. "Suspicious type drifter wagon parked out south of the livery." "I have been treating a patient," she said, "as is my practice." He smiled the smile of a man who found something faintly amusing about a woman using a professional vocabulary. "Well now," he said, "a spinster living alone out here at the edge of things maybe doesn't always know when someone is taking advantage of her good nature." She looked at him. The word landed in her the way such words always landed, with a particular precision, finding the place that was already tender. The 24-year-old standing at the punch bowl, the woman who had been told in a dozen different configurations over 10 years that her solitary state was a condition rather than a choice, a deficiency rather than a design. She felt it arrive, and she felt it briefly sting, and then something that had been building for 3 days, for 10 years, for the entire accumulated length of her life in Dustell, moved through her and displaced it entirely. She was standing on her own porch in front of her own clinic that she had built and run for a decade, and a man who had ridden into her town on the flood tide was standing on her steps, suggesting that her professional judgment was compromised by her personal circumstances. She said, "My patient is a farmhand who sustained a logging injury 2 counties over and required surgical intervention. I have been treating him in accordance with my professional responsibilities." Her voice was entirely level, the way a surface was level when it had been made level deliberately. "The treatment is proceeding successfully." The sheriff looked at her with the reassessing expression of a man who had expected a different response and was recalibrating. "All the same," he said, "I wonder if I might just take a look at your patient logs. Routine inquiry." Cecelia looked at him. She looked at him with the full weight of 10 years of this town. 10 years of being tolerated and questioned and slightly diminished, even by the people who relied on her, and she felt something clarify inside her that had been in the process of clarifying for 3 days, something that had begun in a moment of reckless medical instinct on a rainy threshold, and had been building with every silent competence and every covered hand and every draft gap pressed with rags, and she stood on her porch and looked down at the sheriff from the slightly elevated ground of her own front steps, and she spoke. "If you want to look at my patient log, Sheriff," she said, "ride back to the county seat and bring me a judge's order." She held his gaze without effort and without hostility, purely and completely certain. "Until then, I would ask you to remember that a clinic is a place of medical treatment, not a public inquiry, and that I am a physician of 10 years standing in this community, and that my professional judgment is not, in fact, subject to review by anyone who does not hold a medical degree." The sheriff looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. He looked at the clinic door and then at her face, and something shifted in his expression, the particular shift that happened when a man encountered a wall he had not expected and could not find a way around without acknowledging that the wall was there. "I may be back," he said in the tone of a man preserving the option of a retreat that is not quite fully a retreat. "You are welcome to return with the appropriate documentation," she said pleasantly, "at any time." He stepped off her porch and walked back toward the post office end of the street, and Cecelia watched him go, and then she turned back to her open front door, and in the dim interior of the clinic, partially shadowed, partially visible, she saw Holt standing near the wall. He had heard everything. She knew this without needing to confirm it, the way she knew most things that were sufficiently clear. He had heard every word. She could see in his face, even in the partial shadow of the interior, something that was not gratitude, not exactly because gratitude implied a debt, and what was in his face did not feel like debt. It felt like the expression of a man looking at something he had not known to look for and had found where he had not expected it. She held his gaze for a moment from the porch. Then she came back inside and closed the door, and the clinic was quiet around them, and through the window the mist continued its patient, steady work, and from the back room came the sound of Eli's slow recovering breath. And neither of them said a word, and the silence was not empty. The silence after the door closed was the kind that had weight. Cecelia felt it settle around her as she moved back through the front room toward her desk, the particular quality of quiet that existed between two people who have just passed through something significant together and have not yet found the language for what it was. She did not look at Holt again immediately. She went to her desk and she sat down and she opened her ledger, not because she had entries to make, but because the ledger was a surface she knew how to occupy a familiar territory she could stand in while the rest of her caught up to what had just happened on the porch. She had said those words to the sheriff. She was turning them over now, examining them the way she examined instruments after use, checking for damage, checking for what they had cost her. She had told a county sheriff to produce a judge's order if he wanted access to her records. She had done it on her own front porch in front of whatever portion of Dustell had been watching, which she estimated conservatively at more than half. She had done it clearly and without apology, and she had looked him in the eye while she did it. And the remarkable thing, the thing she kept arriving at when she examined the sequence, was that she had not felt afraid while she was doing it. She had felt certain. That was new. Not the certainty of someone who had rehearsed the speech or had time to prepare, but the certainty of someone who had finally said the thing that had been true for a very long time and had simply been waiting for the right arrangement of circumstances to make itself available. 10 years in Dustell had built that certainty one small stone at a time. One late-night call and one difficult procedure, and one patient recovered, and one bill gently forgiven, and one dismissive comment absorbed and filed and learned from, and what had happened on the porch was simply the moment when the accumulated weight of all those stones had found its proper form. She wrote the date at the top of a fresh ledger page. Behind her she heard Holt move. She heard him cross to the other side of the room. And she heard a sound she identified after a moment as the wooden chair near the window being carefully repositioned, and she thought he was sitting down, giving her the space that he seemed to understand without being told that she sometimes needed. She was wrong. She turned an hour later to reach for a reference volume on the shelf behind her desk, and she saw that he had not been sitting. He had been at the window frame, the one whose lower hinge had been pulling from the wood for 2 seasons, working it back with the small tools she kept in the maintenance drawer beside the supply cabinet, the drawer he should not have known about and clearly did. The hinge was straight now, seated properly in the wood, the screws reset with a precision that would hold through another season at minimum. He was currently on the far side of the room, near the baseboards, running his fingers along the floor joint where the boards met the wall, checking for looseness. Cecelia looked at him. She said, "You do not have to do that." He said without looking up, "I know." She looked at him a moment longer and then turned back to her reference volume and found the page she needed, and the sound of his quiet work continued in the background, unhurried and methodical, and after a time she stopped noticing it as a separate thing, and it simply became part of the sound of the clinic in the afternoon, which was something she had not expected and did not examine too closely. The next 3 days had the particular texture of something suspended. The water receded in increments each day, giving back a little more of the canyon road, each day bringing the bridge closer to passable condition. And each day the news spread through Dustell with the focused urgency of people who had been isolated long enough to make every small development feel significant. Cecelia tracked the reports with the part of her that was always tracking things, noting them and filing them and setting them aside, because the bridge was a variable she could not control, and therefore not the variable she was currently focused on. She was focused on Eli. He improved with the stubborn incremental determination of a young man who had a great deal of living he had not yet gotten to, and whose body seemed to understand this. Each morning she unwrapped the arm and examined the wound in the good light of her clinic, and each morning the news was marginally better, the inflammation retreating by degrees, the color of the surrounding tissue moving through the spectrum from alarming toward merely concerning, toward on the 5th morning something that was approaching the color of health. She changed the dressings with a regularity that bordered on ceremony, and she monitored his temperature with the focused attention of someone for whom a single degree represented the difference between optimism and emergency. On the 4th morning, Eli sat up under his own power for the first time. He did it slowly with the careful economy of someone learning to trust a body that had recently been unreliable, pushing himself up on his good arm and arriving at a seated position against the headboard with the expression of a man who has accomplished something he is not quite willing to celebrate yet, in case the celebration is premature. Cecelia was at the side table preparing the morning's dressings, and she heard the shift in the bed springs and turned and saw him sitting there, and felt the clean, specific satisfaction of a recovery proceeding as it should. "Good morning," she said. He looked at her with the clearer eyes of someone who was genuinely present and said, "Good morning, Dr. Voss." And then, after a pause, "I am hungry." She looked at him. "Hungry?" she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." She set down the dressing roll. "That is the best thing you have said in 4 days," she told him. She made him broth the plain, careful kind that a recovering system could manage, and she brought it to him herself and watched him drink it with the efficient gratitude of someone whose body had reminded him in very specific terms what it was for, and she stood in the doorway of the back room and felt quietly, and without drama, genuinely glad. The cohabitation of the 3 of them in the clinic had developed over the days a rhythm she had not planned for and could not quite account for. The clinic was not a large building. It had the front room, which served as her office and waiting area, the examination room, which was where Eli was recovering, and a small back room that served as storage and occasionally as a place where she sat when she needed to be somewhere that was not in view of the front window. It also had attached to the back a narrow woodshed that connected to the small outdoor area where she kept the woodpile and the water barrels. Holt had claimed no space officially. He slept in the front room on the floor, a fact she had discovered on the 2nd morning when she rose early and found him there rolled in his coat with his hat over his face, occupying the minimum possible footprint of the available floor, as though trying to be as little inconvenience as the physical laws of space permitted. She had looked at him for a moment and then gone to make coffee, and when it was ready, she had set a cup on the table beside him and gone to check on Eli, and when she came back the cup was empty and he was outside, and they had not discussed it. She had, without planning, begun making 2 cups in the morning. The woodpile had been fully restocked on day 3. She had not asked him to do it. She had simply noted on the 2nd evening that it was lower than she liked to keep it going into uncertain weather. And the following morning the shed was full, the wood split and stacked with the tight, weather-conscious precision of someone who understood the relationship between a well-stacked woodpile and a warm room in the months ahead. She had stood in the woodshed doorway for a long moment and looked at it. The stiff hinge on the back door was gone. The loose board in the hallway floor, the one she had learned to step over so automatically that she no longer consciously registered, it was solid underfoot now, renailed from below, with the thoroughness of someone who had gone under the building to do it properly, rather than patching it from above. The small window latch in the examination room that had not quite caught since the summer before last, caught now with a clean, decisive click. He was fixing things. Not ostentatiously, not in the way of someone who wanted credit for the fixing, but with the quiet persistence of a man working through a list that only he could see, addressing each item as he encountered it moving through the building with the attentive care of someone who was not trying to make a statement, but simply could not leave broken things as they were. Cecelia sat with this observation across several evenings and did not know what to do with it. She had received gestures before in the years since the blue silk dress and the punch bowl and the lesson she had learned from both. She had received gifts and attentions, and once or twice, something that she supposed could have been called courtship tentative, and somewhat bewildered, as though the men involved were not entirely sure what they were doing, but felt obscurely that they ought to be doing something. She had received all of these things and had processed them with the careful emotional distance of a woman who has decided on the basis of sufficient evidence that the cost of hoping is not one she is prepared to pay again. This was not any of those things. This was a man who nailed down loose boards and reset stiff hinges and split wood and had coffee ready to not quite hand to her, and who had peppermint oil prepared before she knew she needed it, and none of it came with the quality she had learned to recognize and brace herself for, the quality of expectation of a gesture made as a down payment on something to be collected later. It came with no expectation at all. It came as nearly as she could analyze it from the same place that his silence came from, the place in him that simply could not leave things that needed doing undone. She was thinking about this on the fifth evening when she heard him outside in the area behind the woodshed, and she went to the back window and looked out, and saw him in the last light with the axe splitting the remaining rounds she had not gotten to before the storm, and she stood at the window for a time and watched him work, and she did not tell herself she was watching for any particular reason. She simply watched. The evening of day 6 arrived with news. It came via the boy from 2 streets over, the same 12-year-old with the sprained wrist whose arm had healed cleanly, who knocked on her front door with the energy of someone delivering something important, and told her that the Caldwell brothers had walked the bridge that afternoon and found it passable to foot traffic and to horses by the following morning, and that the sheriff was already making arrangements to leave. Cecelia thanked him. She closed the door. She stood for a moment in the front room. She went to the examination room and told Eli, who received the news, with a complex expression she read as relief and apprehension in roughly equal measure, the expression of someone who was well enough to contemplate the future and uncertain about its shape. She went back to the front room. Holt was there. He had come in through the back, and he was standing near the window with the particular stillness that meant he had already heard or had read the quality of her movement through the building, or had in some other way that she had stopped trying to fully account for, already arrived at the information she was coming to give him. She said, "The bridge is passable by tomorrow morning." He said yes. She looked at him. She said, "Eli will need at minimum another 5 days of care before he can travel without serious risk of reopening the wound. The infection is controlled, but the tissue is not yet stable. Riding will put stress on the arm that it is not yet equipped to manage." He was looking at her with the steady, clear attention she knew. He said, "How many days?" 7 to be safe, she said. 5 at the absolute minimum, and only if he is immobile on the horse. No gripping, no sudden movement. He absorbed this. He turned toward the window and looked at the street, where the last of the day's thin light was making the wet mud look briefly like polished metal, and she watched his profile and saw in it the particular geometry of a man doing arithmetic she could not quite read. She said, "The sheriff is leaving tomorrow morning." He looked back at her. "I know," he said. This was all he said, and it was, she thought, entirely sufficient, because they both understood what it meant and what it did not mean, and what the space between those two things contained, and the conversation did not require more words than it had been given. The following morning the sheriff left early before most of the town was fully awake, which Cecelia noted from her front window with the even-tempered satisfaction of a woman who had found the terms she required. She watched him ride across the newly passable bridge with two other stranded travelers, and she noted the straight line of his back and the speed of his departure. And she thought that whatever observations he intended to make official, he had not found what he needed in Dustell to make them with. She went to make the morning coffee. Holt was already at the back of the clinic, and she heard the sound of something being addressed on the exterior wall, and she made 2 cups and set one on the table by the back door and turned to the front room to begin her morning. The day was quieter than the days before it. The mist had finally cleared, leaving the canyon country in the bright, washed clarity that followed long rain, the kind of light that made the red rock vivid and the sky an almost aggressive blue, and the street of Dustell had the particular energy of a place resuming its normal pace after an interruption. People moved with purpose again, with destinations, and the quality of the watching she had been living under for 6 days shifted most eyes now looking forward rather than sideways. She went to check on Eli at mid-morning and found him in conversation with Holt, who was sitting in the chair beside the bed, which was the first time she had seen him sit in a chair inside the clinic, rather than stand near things or crouch beside them, and the sight of it had a comfortable domestic quality that she noted without quite permitting herself to respond to. Eli looked up when she entered. "Holt says we might be here another week," he said, and there was something in his tone that she read carefully. 5 to 7 days, she said, depending on your arm's progress. Eli looked at his arm and then at her and said in the voice of a young man who had recently been very close to not having a future, and was finding the one he had restored to him unexpectedly full of texture, "That is not the worst news I have ever had." She checked the wound, which was looking better than yesterday, which was looking better than the day before, the steady incremental improvement that was the most honest kind, the kind earned rather than granted. And she redressed it and told him to keep it elevated and not to use it for anything, including trying to help himself sit up, which he accepted with the resigned expression of someone who had learned through painful experience that the doctor's instructions were not opening positions in a negotiation. She left the room. She was at her desk, 3 hours into the afternoon, when she heard the sound that had been absent since the morning of day 2, the sound of voices outside carrying the specific quality of people who were not moving through but were gathered, and she looked up and then looked out the window. There were 4 of them outside the post office, which was not itself unusual, but the quality of the gathering was different from the idle clustering of the flood days. These were people who had made a purposeful decision to stand together and discuss something specific, and she could not hear the words, but she recognized the posture, and she recognized 3 of the 4 faces, including Martha Greer, who was speaking with the focused intensity of a woman who had had a conclusion for some time and was now distributing it. Cecelia looked at them for a moment. Then she looked away and went back to her work. She worked until the afternoon light had shifted to the long golden angle of late day, and then she set down her pen and stretched her hands and rose to check on her patient. Eli was sleeping, which was correct, and good his breathing even, and his color, the best it had been, and she checked his temperature with the back of her hand at his forehead, and found it so close to normal that she stood there for a moment and allowed herself quietly and entirely privately the particular feeling of having won something that had not been certain. She came back to the front room. Holt was at the baseboard on the far side of the room, the last section she had not seen him address, running his fingers along the joint with the systematic attention he gave everything. He had a small pot of wood sealer she had not known she had found somewhere in the maintenance drawer or the woodshed or conjured from some competence she had stopped being surprised by, and he was working it into the gap with careful, even strokes. She stood in the doorway and watched him work. She thought about Eli saying, "Not the worst news I have ever had," and the texture of what he had meant by it, the young man's instinctive sense that time in this particular place was not being spent, but was being accumulated, was turning into something that would matter in the accounting later. She thought about the blue silk dress hanging in its cabinet, unworn for 10 years. She thought about standing on the porch in front of the sheriff and feeling certain, and she traced that certainty back through the previous 6 days to find where it had come from, following it back through the surgery and the litter in the street and the wagon in the flood and the moment on the threshold when she had looked at a man's silence and understood it was not a wall but a door, and she had chosen to open it. Holt finished the baseboard section. He rose and looked at it with the same evaluative attention he gave completed work, confirming it was what it needed to be. Then he set the pot down and turned and saw her standing in the doorway. They looked at each other across the width of the room in the late afternoon light. She said, "Eli's fever is nearly gone." He said, "I know. I could hear it in your step when you came back down the hall." She looked at him. "You can hear that. Your step is different when you are worried," he said, and he said it in the matter-of-fact way he said most things as a piece of information he had gathered and was now reporting without performance or intention beyond the accuracy of the observation itself. She was still looking at him. She said slowly, "How long have you been paying that kind of attention?" He met her gaze. "Since the first night," he said. The room was very quiet. Outside, the street had the settled sounds of early evening, the distant close of a door, somewhere a horse at the livery, the ordinary music of a town returning to itself. Inside, the lamp on her desk had begun to assert itself against the fading day, and its light reached across the floor between them. She said, "The bridge is passable. You could have left this morning." He said, "Yes." She said, "Eli could have been moved to a wagon bed. It would have been a risk to the arm, but it could have been done." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why didn't you?" He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw him weighing something, not the weighing of a man deciding whether to tell the truth, but the weighing of a man deciding how to give it the shape it deserved without giving it more shape than the moment could hold. He said, "You know why?" She did know. She had known for at least 2 days, had known it, with the same quality of knowing with which she knew a wound was healing, the evidence accumulating past the point where not knowing was an honest position. She had been maintaining not knowing because it was a position she had learned to maintain for very good reasons that still existed and that she was not ready to set down without examining them first. She looked at him across the lamplight. She said, "I am not a woman who makes decisions on the basis of feeling alone." "I know," he said. She said, "I do not know anything about you. I know your name and your brother's name, and I know that you have been careful about what you have told me, and I have been careful about what I have asked." "Yes," he said. She said, "I am going to ask now." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "Ask." And she opened her mouth to begin, and from outside came the sound she had not been expecting, the sound of a rider in the street, moving with the purposeful speed of someone who was not passing through, but arriving, and then the clatter of dismounting, and then a voice she did not know calling out for the sheriff, calling for him with the urgency of someone who had ridden hard to find him. And she saw something move in Holt's face that moved through her too, a cold certainty arriving without warning. The sheriff had already gone. The rider did not know this yet. But the rider knew something, and whatever it was, it had ridden hard to get here. and Holt was looking at her from across the lamplit room with his face completely still and his eyes carrying the weight of what had been kept carefully unspoken for 6 days. And she looked back at him and felt the fragile architecture of the thing that had been building quietly in her clinic, in her woodshed, in the sound of nails and the weight of a steady hand, tremble for the first time on its foundations. She did not look away, and neither did he. And outside, the writer's voice continued its carrying, urgent and unaware, into the evening air. She moved first. That was the thing she would remember afterward, not with regret, but with the particular clarity of a moment that had defined something essential about who she was and who she had chosen to become. While the writer's voice was still carrying in the street outside, while Holt was still standing across the room from her, with the weight of the unspoken pressing visibly against the stillness of his face, Cecelia crossed to the front window and looked out. The writer was young trail dusty and clearly had not slept in a considerable number of hours. He was standing beside a lathered horse in the middle of the street, asking anyone who would listen for the sheriff, and the 2 men who had emerged from the post office were telling him with the particular relish of people delivering significant news that the sheriff had ridden out that very morning. Cecelia watched the writer receive this information and watched his posture change, the urgency deflating into a frustrated uncertainty, and she made her assessment. He was not a deputy. He had no badge visible, and his clothes were working clothes, not official ones. He was a messenger of some kind, someone who had been given a task and a direction, and had ridden hard to complete both, and the task had just gotten complicated by the sheriff's absence. She turned back into the room. Holt was watching her. He had not moved toward the door or away from it. He was simply waiting with the quality of absolute stillness she had come to understand was not passivity, but a form of respect, the waiting of a man who had decided that the next move belonged to her and who would not take it from her by moving first. She looked at him. She said, "Tell me." It was not a demand. It was not the voice she had used on the sheriff, the voice built from 10 years of professional authority. It was quieter than that and more direct, and it carried in it the full weight of 6 days of earned proximity, 6 days of peppermint oil and steady hands and nailed floorboards, and 2 cups of coffee every morning, 6 days of becoming someone who understood what it felt like to have a person in her space who asked for nothing she had not already decided to give. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down." She sat. Not because he had told her to, but because something in her recognized that this was going to require the kind of listening that standing did not fully support, the kind that needed a stillness in the body to match the stillness she was going to have to find in herself. He sat across from her, not at the desk, but in the chair near it, and he leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, and he looked at the floor for a moment, and then looked at her, and she saw him make the decision to give her the whole truth, the way she had seen patients make the decision to describe a symptom they had been avoiding with the particular quality of someone setting down a weight they had been carrying long enough to understand it was not going to get lighter. He said, 3 years ago, Eli and I were working cattle for a rancher named Calvert in the New Mexico Territory. Calvert ran a legitimate operation, and we worked it straight. The foreman, a man named Drace, was running a secondary operation on the side, rustling stock from neighboring spreads and staging it through Calvert's land to make it look legitimate. When we found out Eli was 18, he wanted to go to the law immediately. I told him to let me handle it. He paused. She said nothing. "I handled it wrong," he said, and the 3 words carried in them a weight that had clearly been carried a long time, pressed down by repetition into something very dense. I confronted Drace privately. I thought I could make him stop without involving Eli, without putting the boy in the middle of something that could go badly. Drace had friends with the county office. When it came out looking like Eli and I were part of the operation, and Drace was the one who had tried to stop us. She was very still. "Charges were filed," he said. "Eli was arrested. I got him out before it went to a formal hearing, which is to say I got him out in a way that a court of law would characterize as unlawful, and since then we have been moving. The warrant is county-level New Mexico territory. It has no legal standing in Texas, but a cooperative sheriff who wants the bounty does not always concern himself with jurisdictional niceties." He looked at her steadily. "The wound happened when we were moving through the canyon, a rock fall. He went down and the arm caught the edge of a cut shelf. By the time I found a town with a doctor, the infection had already set in." The room was quiet. Outside, she could hear the rider's horse moving, the sound of the animal being walked toward the livery, the crisis of the messenger's arrival settling into the practical logistics of a man and a tired horse needing water and rest. Cecelia sat with everything he had told her, and she did it honestly. Examining each piece with the same methodical attention she brought to a complex diagnosis. A man who had made a wrong call out of the right impulse protecting his younger brother. A system that had rewarded the wrong person. A warrant built on a lie and upheld by the kind of cooperative corruption that she had seen the edges of enough times to find it entirely plausible. 2 men, running one of them barely more than a boy, for 3 years. She said, "The rider outside, is he connected to Drace?" Holt said, "I do not know. He may be. Drace has money enough to send people if he knows which direction we went." She said, "But he asked for the sheriff." Holt said, "Yes." She said, "The sheriff is gone." "Yes," he said, "for now." She looked at him and said the question she needed the answer to, not because she did not already suspect it, but because she needed to hear it from him directly in his own words, so that she could know it in the way she needed to know things that mattered. "Did you or Eli participate in the rustling?" He held her gaze without flinching, without the particular quality of a man managing his expression, simply looking at her with the gray, clear eyes that had never once in 6 days tried to look like something other than what they were. "No," he said. She nodded. She rose from the chair and went to the window and looked out. The rider was gone toward the livery. The street was settling again. She stood at the window for a moment with her hand on the frame whose hinge Holt had reset 3 days ago, and she thought. Then she turned around. She said, "You need to leave before he asks around and finds out the sheriff was here for 6 days and was already asking about you. Once he knows that he will go back for the sheriff, and it will not matter that there is no Texas jurisdiction." Holt said, "I know." She said, "Eli cannot ride hard. He cannot grip the reins with that arm under any circumstances, and he cannot sustain a gallop." Holt said, "I know." She said, "There is a route through the northern canyon that does not cross the main road. It comes out 12 miles east of the county line near a settlement called Garber's Crossing, where there is a man named Hutchins who runs a small infirmary. I have corresponded with him. He is a good physician and a discreet one, and he will continue Eli's care without asking questions that do not belong to him." She crossed to her desk and pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer and began writing as she talked. "I am writing you a medical transfer letter that describes the injury, the treatment, and the current status of the wound. It will tell Hutchins everything he needs to know. It will not tell him anything else." She heard Holt stand. She kept writing. She wrote the letter with the clean precision of a physician's correspondence, the specific and the clinical, the necessary, and not a word beyond it, and she folded it and sealed it with the practical wax seal she used for official medical documents, and she held it out to him. He took it. She said, looking at the sealed letter rather than his face, "I should have asked you sooner." He said, "No. You asked when you were ready to hear the answer. That was the right time." She looked up at him. He was standing closer than the desk transaction required, and she saw in his face Everything she had been cataloging for 6 days, arranged now in a different order, the same materials, but a different structure. Everything that had been distributed carefully across the small gestures and the silent attentions and the steady hands gathered now into a single expression that she could read completely. She said, "You should get Eli ready to move. The rider will rest his horse a few hours. You should be through the North Canyon entrance before dark." He said, "All right." He did not move immediately. He said, "Cecelia." It was the first time he had used her name. She had noticed in the way she noticed everything that he had not used it before, had referred to her as Doctor, or had not referred to her by any name at all, and hearing it now in his low, stripped-down voice had the quality of a door opening. She said, "Yes." He said, "I am going to come back." She looked at him. She understood that she was being offered something here, not a performance, and not a promise designed to make departure easier for both of them. She was being offered the same thing he had been offering in one form or another since the first night, which was the plain, undecorated truth without more shape than it could honestly carry. She said, "I know you intend to." He said, "That is not the same as saying you believe I will." She held his gaze. She said, "No, it is not." He accepted this. He nodded once, the single nod of a man receiving a fair assessment, and then he turned and went to get his brother, and she stood at her desk with her hands flat on its surface and breathed. The next hour had the compressed, purposeful quality of all departures that were also risks. She helped Eli dress with the careful efficiency of a physician, managing a recovering patient under a timeline, showing him how to keep the arm positioned and how to support it during mounting, and what signs to watch for that would tell him the wound needed immediate attention. She gave him the remainder of her carbolic supply and a roll of clean dressing, and told him how to change it and how often, and she told him both of these things twice, because he was young, and young men had a tendency to decide they were fine before they were fully fine. He looked at her when she was done, his young man's face carrying an expression that was more complex than his age should have been able to produce, and he said, "Thank you, Dr. Voss." She said, "You're welcome, Eli." He said with the particular earnestness of a young man who has been close enough to his own death to have lost his previous tolerance for leaving things unsaid. "He does not say things. You know that. But I want you to know that I have been traveling with my brother for 3 years, and in all of that time I have not seen him be what he has been here. Whatever that is worth to you." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Get on the horse and hold it to a walk until you are through the canyon entrance." He smiled at her, the easy, open smile of a boy becoming a man, and she thought he was going to be all right this one, and the thought produced in her the clean, uncomplicated gladness that was one of the best things her work had ever given her. They went out the back. She did not go to the front window to watch them leave. She stood in the back room and listened to the sound of horses moving carefully through the rear property, the sound receding with the deliberate pace she had prescribed, and she stood there until she could not hear them any more. And the clinic was quiet in the specific way of a space that had held 3 people for 6 days and now held 1. She went to her desk. She sat down. She looked at the open ledger in front of her, and she picked up her pen, and she entered the final notation for Eli Maddox, the date, and the condition, and the transfer to Dr. Hutchins at Garber's Crossing, and she wrote it in the same careful hand she used for all her entries. And when she was done, she looked at what she had written, and then she looked at the cabinet in the corner of the room. The blue silk dress hung where it had hung for 10 years. She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the ledger. The following weeks moved in the ordinary rhythm of a clinic in a small canyon town, which was to say they were busy in the practical and unglamorous way that all genuine work, was busy, full of the specific and the immediate and the necessary. The bridge was fully repaired by the end of the first week after the flood, and the road reopened, and Dustell reconnected itself to the county, and the county to the territory, and the world resumed its accustomed dimensions. Patients came as they always came, with the full range of what human bodies did when they were not being properly looked after, and she treated them with the skill and the directness that had been her practice for 10 years. Martha Greer came in the second week with a hip complaint that was genuine. And also, Cecelia understood a social call structured around a medical pretext, and she treated the hip complaint thoroughly and received the social call with the patient composure of a woman who had decided she was not going to apologize for anything and was not going to explain anything and was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of a visible wound. Martha said, in the way of someone who had been composing a sentence for some time, "People are saying you were harboring criminals." Cecelia said, "I was treating a patient." Martha looked at her with the assessing eyes of a woman who was genuinely trying to determine what she was seeing, whether the thing in front of her was a scandal or something else entirely. She said, "The sheriff seemed to think." Cecelia said, "The sheriff thought a great many things. The sheriff is welcome to continue thinking them in the county seat." She finished her notes on the hip and handed Martha the recommended treatment with the brisk finality of a woman closing a subject. "Twice daily, warm compress for 20 minutes. Come back in a fortnight." Martha left. The next caller said nothing at all about it, and the one after that said something oblique that Cecelia declined to engage with, and by the end of the second week, the conversational temperature of Dustell on the subject of Dr. Voss and the drifter's wagon had shifted from active to residual, the way a fire shifted when it ran out of the specific fuel it needed, still present but no longer producing heat. She wrote a letter to Dr. Hutchins at Garver's Crossing in the third week, a professional inquiry, asking for a status update on a patient she had transferred. His reply came back in 11 days, a clean and specific letter from a man who wrote the way she wrote with the precision of someone who understood that clarity was a form of respect. The patient was recovering well. The wound was healing without complication. The young man was demonstrating a gratifying degree of compliance with treatment instructions, which she read as Eli, having been sufficiently frightened by his near miss to have developed a permanent respect for medical authority. She read the letter twice and then filed it in the patient folder she had kept for Eli Maddox. The folder she had been keeping since the night she wrote his name in her ledger for the first time, and she put the folder on the shelf with the others and went back to her work. She did not hear from Holt. She had not expected to hear from him immediately. She had understood, in the way she understood things that had been clearly communicated without words, that what he needed to do was get Eli somewhere stable, and then address the underlying problem, the warrant, the lie, at its foundation, the man named Drace who had built it. These were not things that resolved quickly or simply. She had been practicing medicine long enough to know that the most significant infections were also the most resistant to treatment, and she had applied this understanding with the directness she tried to apply to most things that mattered to her, to the situation as it stood. She had told him she knew he intended to come back. She had not told him she believed he would. She sat with the difference between those two things across the weeks, examining it honestly, turning it over in the quiet evenings when the clinic was done for the day and the lamp was low and the canyon country outside was settling into the particular beauty of a high desert autumn, the red rock going deeper in the slant light, the air sharpening. On the 41st day after they left, she opened the cabinet. She did not take the dress out immediately. She stood in front of the open cabinet and looked at it, this piece of silk, the color of a clear midday sky, that had been hanging in the dark for 10 years, waiting for an occasion that Cecelia Vane had decided on the basis of one wretched summer evening in 1877 was never going to arrive. She looked at it and she thought about the 24-year-old who had bought it, and the 34-year-old who was looking at it now, and she thought about the distance between those two women and what the distance had cost and what it had produced. And she made a decision, not for an occasion, not for a man, not to signal anything to anyone, or to mark a moment she needed external validation to make real. She took the dress from the cabinet, and she put it on because she wanted to, because 10 years of careful, disciplined, competent, solitary living had earned her the right to wear a blue silk dress on a Tuesday afternoon, simply because it was beautiful and it was hers, and she had decided she was done waiting for permission. She put it on. She went and stood in front of the small mirror above the wash basin and looked at herself at the woman in the blue dress in the good autumn light. And she looked for a long time without judgment, with the same careful, honest attention she tried to bring to things that mattered, and what she saw was a woman who was in the plainest and most complete sense of the word herself. She went and sat on the front porch. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and the street of Dustell was going about its ordinary business. And the sky was the particular blue that came after summer, deeper and cleaner, and the air tasted of rock and dry grass, and the first edge of the cold that would come in November. She sat in her porch chair with her hands in her lap, and the silk cool and real against her skin, and she watched the street, and she thought about nothing in particular, and everything at once, which was the specific quality of thought that came when a person was genuinely quietly at peace. She heard the hooves before she saw him. One horse moving at the pace of a man who had been riding a long distance and had arrived at his destination and was no longer in a hurry because hurry was no longer the relevant thing. She turned her head toward the south end of the street, toward the canyon road, which was where the sound was coming from, and she watched him ride into Dustell in the afternoon light, and she felt something in her chest move with the quiet seismic certainty of a thing that has been held in tension for a very long time finally releasing. He was alone. He rode up the street at a walk, and she saw him see her from a distance, saw the moment when he registered what he was looking at. A woman on a porch in a blue dress in the afternoon sun, and she saw him take that in with the same complete, unhurried attention he gave everything, and she held his gaze as he came closer and did not look away. He stopped at the front of the clinic. He sat on the horse for a moment and looked at her. She looked at him. He dismounted. He did it with the ease of a man whose body knew horses the way her hands knew instruments, and he looped the reins over the post at the foot of the steps, and he reached into the saddlebag and placed a folded document carefully in the bag's outer pocket, not putting it away, but making it available. And she understood without being told that it was something official, something resolved, something that had required 41 days to complete and was now complete. He walked to the foot of the porch steps. He looked up at her in the blue dress in the October light, and she looked back at him, and the street went about its business around them, and neither of them rushed the moment because rushing it would have cost it something it had earned the right to have. She said, "Eli is well. Dr. Hutchins wrote to me. He said, he is well. He is working a ranch near Garber's Crossing. The foreman is a decent man." A pause. "He asked me to tell you that he is complying with all medical instructions." She said, "I am glad to hear it." He said, "The warrant is cleared." Drace had been working the same scheme on 2 other spreads. When the second set of ranchers went to the territorial court together, the full record came out. He said it in the matter-of-fact way he said most things, without drama, without the performance of relief, simply as information being accurately reported. "There is nothing following us." She held his gaze. She said, "You came back." He said, "Yes." She said, "I told you I knew you intended to." He said, "You did." She said, "I did not say I believed you would." He held her gaze steadily, without defense, with the same plain openness that had been his consistent offering from the first night the refusal to claim more than he had actually earned. He said, "No, you did not." She looked at him for a long moment, at the gray eyes and the weathered face and the quiet, formidable patience of him, at the man who had fixed the hinges and the floorboards and the draft gap, who had had peppermint oil ready, who had sat in the mud in the rain without asking for a single acknowledgment of the sitting, who had told her the truth when she asked for it in the exact shape it actually was. She said, "I believe you now." Something moved in his face, and it was not relief. Exactly, it was something deeper than relief, the expression of a man receiving something he had been honest enough with himself to know he wanted, and uncertain enough about to have spent 41 days with the uncertainty, and she saw it arrive in him and settle, and she felt in the watching of it the particular warmth of a thing that has been earned on both sides. He came up the steps. He stood in front of her on the porch of her clinic, the clinic she had built over 10 years from nothing in the canyon country of West Texas on a Tuesday in late October, and she stood in her blue dress and looked at him from the ground of everything she had made herself into. Not the 24-year-old waiting for permission, not the woman who had converted discipline into a substitute for living, but the woman who had walked through a flood in the middle of the night and operated by lantern light, and stood on her own porch and told a county sheriff to bring a judge's order, the woman who had put on the blue silk dress because she wanted to and not for any other reason. She put her hand against his chest. Not a surrender, a choice made with the full force of a complete and self-determined woman, choosing which was a different thing entirely from being chosen, from being found or rescued or completed it. She was not incomplete. She had not been incomplete. She was a whole person choosing another whole person, and the wholeness of it, the mutual, clear-eyed wholeness of two people standing in honest daylight and saying yes was the thing she had not understood at 24, was the thing actually worth wanting. He covered her hand with his, the same hand that had covered her trembling hands after the surgery, large and steady and warm, and she felt it now, without trembling with the steadiness that came from 6 weeks of living into a decision that had already been made and found to be correct. She said against the quiet of the October afternoon, "You are going to need a place to stay." He said, with the warmth that lived underneath his particular economy of expression, the warmth that had been there from the beginning for anyone who knew how to look for it, "I was hoping you might know of one." She looked at him. She said, "There is a room at the back. The woodshed needs attention, and the north wall has a draft I have not been able to locate." He said, "I will find it." She said, "I know you will." And she did not ask when he was leaving again, because the question was no longer the shape of the thing between them, and he did not offer assurances about staying, because assurances were not what he dealt in, and she did not need them. What she needed, and what she had, was the plain, solid, nailed-down reality of a man who had ridden back into Dustell on a Tuesday and come up her porch steps, and the plain, solid, nailed-down reality of a woman who had been standing on those steps in a blue dress waiting for nothing and no one, and had found in that posture of complete self-sufficiency exactly what she had stopped believing in. Behind them, through the clinic window, the late afternoon light lay across the empty cabinet in the corner. The cabinet whose glass door stood open for the first time in 10 years, and the hook inside it was bare, and the blue silk dress was exactly where it belonged, which was on the woman who had earned it. The canyon country settled into its autumn evening around them, the red rock deepening the sky going gold at its edges. The street of Dustell carrying its ordinary sounds in the ordinary way of a world that did not know and did not need to know. That something had been resolved on this particular porch, on this particular Tuesday. Something that had begun in a flood and a knock and a silence, and had arrived here, at last, at its proper home.